Hello and welcome. Coming up tonight, is the government spending too much or too little on public services? I'll ask the Minister who sets departmental budgets, Darren Jones. The Tories say the Chancellor got it wrong, but what would they do differently? The Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, will say. Anushka and Screeny will explain why this matters to all of us.
The Chancellor's decisions have made some departments big winners and others worried losers. But will we feel the benefits in key areas like health?
And giving a critique from left and right, the former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell and Reform's Deputy Leader Richard Tice. Watcher. Now, what Rachel Reeves announced today wasn't a budget, but in some ways it was more important. It'll determine whether crumbling public services are rehabilitated before the next general election and also whether the productivity of the country is boosted to end 15 years of stagnating living standards. Now, after the Chancellor announced day-to-day spending by the NHS in England and Wales would rise in real terms by 3% a year to an eye-watering £226 billion in 3 years, you might think that would be enough for us to be able to see a GP when we want and not have to wait 2 years for a hip replacement. Because the entire UK will look at that point like an enormous health service that just happens to be attached to an economy. However, the ageing of the population and the NHS's current chaotic condition means that even £240 billion, that's that day-to-day spending plus capital investment, might not be enough. Also, surely £113 billion of investment in rail and buses and nuclear plant and affordable housing will give enough oomph to our productive potential. Well, it will help. But only in defence is the annual rate of growth in capital spending on nukes, submarines and munitions actually transformative. And then there are the political promises that, remind me of promises made by the Truth Fairy, such as that no asylum seeker would be housed in a hotel by the end of the Parliament. How will this be done? Answer, was there none? So Rachel Reeves is asking the Home Secretary to roll the dice for £1 billion. Here's the nutshell. The spending review was neither bold enough to get the growth juices properly flowing, nor conservative enough to pull interest rates significantly lower. In hanging terms, for Starmer and Reeves, it was neither a sheep or a goat. Anushka.
The spending review really had two sides to it. The bit that Rachel Reeves wanted to show off and the bit she didn't talk so much about. Let's start with the bit she was most excited about, her £113 billion of capital spending, big investment projects like Sizewell C. This chart from the Resolution Foundation tracks capital spending as a share of GDP over time since the 1950s. And it groups it into three categories. In blue, what they call social spending on things like housing and schools and health, things people really feel the effect of in everyday life. In red, economic investment on power stations, science, technology, transport, all things that have a bigger impact on growth. And you can see on those two a massive turnaround. From the 50s to 70s, social spending was much higher, and no wonder. That was when we created the NHS. All of it plummeted through the 80s, and now the focus is much more on economic investment because they are determined to drive growth. But with the exception of our third line, the green line, defence, other areas are actually very front-loaded and are going to drop back in time. Then we move on to the most painful bit of today, the day-to-day spending. This chart shows departments with increased spending on the right and decreases on the left. So it shows the big winners. Here we've got science and technology, and also here at the top, health. And actually, because of the amount we spend on health, this is huge. This is 90% of the total spending rise that we've seen today, and it's paid for by £2.4 billion of cuts elsewhere. So big losses, including for the Home Office here, that's a 6% reduction, and in environment here, that's a 9% reduction. And actually, none of that compares a longer-term trend. If we compare the budgets in real terms to 2010, you can see there are actually big declines all over the place. So while this isn't austerity, it doesn't reverse the effects of austerity.
Thanks, Anushka. I should probably point out for those who are not great science and technology fans, I am obviously a science and technology fan, its actual budget is trivial in day-to-day terms. It's just gone up a bit. John, I need to ask you, since this Chancellor said time and again these were proper Labour choices and a proper Labour spending announcement, did you agree with that?
First steps. On the capital spend, she changed the fiscal rule to close to the one that I adopted, which would give her more capital spend. That's the first thing. She also did the review of the Green Book, the Treasury, so you could spend it all around the country. I announced that in 2018, so I was pleased with that.
But, for example, when you strip out some of the initiatives that you would approve of in education, you know, for example, breakfast clubs, actually, it does look as though spending per pupil may not rise at all.
The problem is this, and I think this is the lack of political strategy. You know as well as I do that when you do infrastructure spend, even in housing, it takes time to work out before people feel the benefits. But if you're continuing on the revenue side with almost standstill, and in some areas, austerity, particularly with regard to the threat to welfare benefits, people react against that. So you lose that political capital that you might gain from the overall infrastructure investment. So I just think the political strategy, they don't seem to have learnt the lessons from the winter fuel allowance problem.
I mean, Richard, there was quite big spending on transport projects in parts of the world which are important to you, particularly the Midlands and the North. So I assume that particularly when it comes to the investments in things like nuclear power, road, rail, housing, you'd be in favour of that?
Yeah, I'm in favour of well-targeted infrastructure spend, of course. And yes, the Chancellor's targeted in places like Wales, the Midlands and the North, that yes, they need it, but coincidentally, it's where, of course, Reform are doing extremely well, polling ahead of Labour in many cases.
Yeah, but you might start to lose that support, given that Labour is investing in that part of the world.
But the issue is the money going to be well spent? And how's it going to be paid for? And what she didn't talk about was the vast increase in borrowing that this is going to require, unless she's going to come back in the autumn in her budget with massive tax increases. I mean, you know, people have been trying to sort of challenge me on how you spend for some of our programmes. Let me tell you...
Hang on, your black hole is significantly bigger than this one. And we're going to come...
Robert, that is complete...
We're going to come back... I'm going to give you your opportunity to... You're going to have the opportunity to explain your economic policy in a few minutes.
Her spending now is completely... It's a massive splurge. It's going to require hundreds of billions more debt, right?
No, it's not. That's a made-up number.
She's spending hundreds of billions of pounds. Where's it going to come from? It's either going to come from taxes or borrowing. That's the reality. And just in April, Robert, right, she's borrowed £20 billion, some 15% more than the OBR forecast just back in March. So spending...
Your hundreds of billions number is just wrong, but I'm going to come back to you on all of this. John, I think you wanted to... Well, actually, I wanted to ask you something, John. One of the things that was very striking is plainly Labour is worried about reform because actually in the budget, the statement she made today, she attacked Nigel Farage and reform more than she criticised anybody else.
I think that's a tactical mistake. I'm from the old school where you never used to put your opponent's name on your leaflets. You don't give them that platform. And if you're going to make jokes about them, make them effective. Can you remember Dennis Healey did that thing with regard to one of his opponents where he just said, it's like being savaged by a dead sheep. And it destroyed the reputation of it. Soft jokes.
We don't, I'm afraid, have politicians quite so adept at those put-downs these days.
And Farage just enjoyed it. That was
we loved it. It was great.
It was pointless.
We could tell you were enjoying it, which is why I was wondering whether she was altogether well advised to do it. Now, look, I've got so much more I need to talk to both of you about. We've also got Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, on the show in a bit now. But I'm going to go to an interview I did a little earlier on. I spoke to the man who's responsible for setting all Labour ministers' budgets. He's the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones. And I began by pointing out that all departments claim, and you can see this in black and white in the statements they put out, to have made 5% efficiency savings, though none of them could name a single service they were providing that they were going to cut completely. So is it really the case, I ask, that everything that the public sector does is essential?
Well, there was quite a lot of stuff that the departments went through and decided that they wanted to reallocate the spend into other priorities, or to be able to run bits of their department more cheaply and then to reallocate that spend.
But literally
Tens of
everything the
billions of
public
pounds.
sector does is essential.
Sure, but there are things like, I don't know, the number of letters HMRC sends. HMRC is now doing everything digitally, so it saves a lot of money as a consequence of doing that. I mean, it's not particularly newsy, to be honest, but it's just, as I say, just running your organisation more effectively, which is, what taxpayers expect us to do in the public sector.
I mean, it was only that you made such a song and dance about this zero-based review and how you're going to find all these efficiencies. I'm sort of slightly staggered at how dull, in the end, it all turns out to be. But the thing that did stand out for me, which slightly worried me, is there is a table of efficiencies, and absolutely the lion's share of the efficiencies have been found by health and by defence. And they're the two departments that are getting enormous sums of extra money. So how will we ever know if they're going to be more productive?
Well, the reason the number's bigger is because 5% of a bigger number is a bigger number. So, like, if the NHS department is £200 billion a year, then 5% is bigger for them than it is for a department that
240
spends,
billion. 200, you should know
50,
that.
Well, by 28, 29, I'm talking about figures today. That's the reason why those numbers look different. But as I say, the Office for Value for Money has gone round all of those departments. We've assessed their efficiency plans. Yeah. This is the first time government's ever done this, by the way. I mean, it is a bit boring, but it's really important. We're going to be sharing that with Parliament and with the National Audit Office. This is just good practice in making sure that you're constantly running your services as efficiently as possible.
Now, one of the big savings we heard from the Chancellor was you're going to get all asylum seekers out of hotels by the end of the Parliament to save £1 billion. How are you going to do that?
Well, the primary problem that we have at the moment is that the reason an asylum seeker is in a hotel is because they're here waiting for a decision, or they're waiting to be returned home if they've not been allowed to stay. And the reason that that's a big problem is because, for lots of reasons, the last government stopped making decisions and stopped doing returns. And so the population of asylum seekers staying in hotels grew enormously. That is obviously not how you should run the system. Decisions should be made quickly. If you are having to stay whilst a decision is made, you should be staying in a cheaper government-owned room, not paying a going rate for a hotel chain. And if you're not allowed to stay, then you need to be sent back to where you came from quickly. We're already doing that. We had over 20,000 people returned in
So
the
just to be
first 11
clear,
months of
you
this
are
government.
confident, genuinely, because I am slightly gobsmacked, given the numbers that are coming across the channel at the moment, that you can get all of them out of hotels and onto government-owned or leased property by the end of the Parliament.
Yeah, because the size of people waiting for a decision will shrink. So the number of rooms you need is smaller because we're sending more people home when they've not been successful in seeking asylum. And as I say, because we're moving the temporary accommodation costs from expensive hotel rooms to cheaper government-owned facilities.
Now, you are picking a fight with the police. They say they're not getting enough money. Why are they wrong?
Look, it's understandable the police make the case for their public services. We're very grateful to them for all of the work that they do for us.
You're grateful that they're humiliating you?
I don't think they're humiliating us. I think they're just making the case for what they do, and they're entitled to do that. But from a Treasury perspective, I'll just point to the fact that police budgets are increasing by over 2% in this spending review. That's a good settlement in the fiscal circumstances. Doesn't mean life is going to be easy for the police, no, but look, there's no public service that's going to find life easy because we've got a whole load of problems we need to fix and the economy's not growing and all the things that we've talked about in the past. But in the context of this spending review, which increases public spending significantly over the course of this Parliament, the police are getting over 2% a year increase in their budgets, and that's a good thing.
So, John, this is a government that likes to make what you might call set itself slightly courageous targets, like 1.5 million houses in the course of this government. You just heard Darren say he was absolutely confident there'd be no asylum seekers in hotels in a couple of years' time. Do you think that's right? Do you think it's going to happen?
I think it's a challenge. Let me put it that way. Because of experience I've got more asylum seekers in hotels than I can see. I've got 2,000 to 2,500. The processing that's happening now, I have to credit the government. It is speeding up dramatically.
Right.
And about 90% of them are getting status which enables them then to go off and work.
Right.
If we can...
And once they're working, they're no longer in the hotel?
Well, they can... What happens is they get assessed, they get status, they're giving 56 days to move out of the hotel.
And how many of them are actually being removed from the country?
The issue, the numbers...
Probably very few.
The numbers, I think, is about 15,000, the government said recently.
But if you look at yours, as a percentage of yours, how many are actually...
Usually about 10%, 15%, like that. But
right.
What's interesting, and this is really, we need to understand it properly, when they get status, if they can get into work quick, what I'm amazed at, I tour around the hotel, the range of skills is unbelievable at all levels. So I think there is a good government argument that if you can get these processed properly, get people into work in local communities and all the rest of it, I think there's a real chance you can reduce the need for that sort of accommodation. But it does need a recognition that the processing has to be quicker, but also the support into work has to be quicker and more effective. I tell you, meeting some of the people, you would be amazed about the potential that there is there for these people.
Darren Jones is saying that basically Labour is shooting your fox. Your big argument is you're the person who's going to solve this, problem that many people have with the numbers here. Is he going to succeed?
Well, I think John's just admitted what many people are worried about, which is that basically 80 to 90% of all asylum applications are going to be granted rapidly. I mean, that's easy. That's not difficult in a form of amnesty. What does that mean?
No, it's because they're refugees.
No, they're people who come here illegally. No, they've come here illegally, breaking the laws, coming here.
They're accepted as refugees. That's what the status means.
No, it
means they're
means
accepted in international law as refugees.
They've come here illegally, primarily as economic migrants.
No,
the reality is, it's easy to accept them.
They won't get status.
Actually, John is right on this. They wouldn't get status if they were purely economic.
No, they don't get status.
John, so why are they all being accepted then? You're accepting between 75 to 90%.
Come and meet some. They're from Syria.
I've done exactly
they're from war zones all over.
Some are from Albania, some are from Turkey, some are from India.
Well, if they're economic
from
migrants,
Bangladesh, they're not war
accepted.
zones, John.
It's
But the reality is,
But economic migrants are not accepted.
If they're accepted, then yes, they move out of the hotels. Where do they go? They go into British housing. We've got a housing shortage, so they're going to gobble up. And what will happen? That will create a huge magnet where the word goes out. The British are soft on illegal asylum,
go in and
so
work
ever
and
more
make a huge contribution to our economy.
Would you accept that will therefore attract more people to come here
You're talking to a grandchild of an Irish migrant. We built the country. We built the roads.
Fantastic.
We staffed the NHS.
But you came here legally,
and that's
John.
What
You
these
didn't come
people,
here illegally, did you?
There was no such status in those days. These people are accepted as refugees.
And it lacks
they
the
want
huge
to make their
ever more
contribution.
So this certainly has been an illuminating conversation about the two different positions on this issue. We're not going to solve it now, much as I'd like to. Screeny is going to share some stuff with us.
Yeah, I just want to talk about health again. I did tell you that health was a significant winner today, and that is in part because things really need to improve. Just look at these 4 charts tracking key targets in the NHS. So this is the cancer 2-month wait in England. These are A&E 4-hour waits. This is 6-week diagnoses, and then this is the 18-week target for elective procedures, all tracking from 2011. You can see the dotted lines are the targets, and all of them, after COVID actually, fell off a cliff. None of them have recovered. The big target here on electives has not been hit since 2015. So is the spending review going to help? The Health Foundation have looked at the trajectory required to hit increasing demand in the NHS. So we have billions, hundreds of billions of pounds up the side and years across the bottom. So the top line is what they say we need to keep up with demand if there is no productivity growth in the health. It reaches £214 billion by 28-29. The next line shows what we need if there is a 1% increase in productivity, up to 205 billion. If we manage 2% of productivity, we only need to go to just under 200 billion pounds. This is where the spending review placed us today. Not bad, actually. They will need to make the NHS a bit more efficient, boost productivity by just under 1%. But if they achieve that, then we are on track. But at what cost? These bars that I'm about to show you represent total Westminster government spending over 20 years. The blue bit is spending on the NHS in England, and the purple is all other departments. Now, that yellow line through the middle tracks the percentage of the total going to health. You can see the percentages over here. And what you can see is that it has risen consistently from 33% back in 2009-10. And now the Resolution Foundation have calculated that after today, it is heading to be 49% of total spending by the end of the decade. With defence also rising, that is squeezing everything else.
Those are really quite startling numbers, Anushka. And in the second part of my interview with the Treasury Chief Secretary, Darren Jones, I pointed out that the NHS will soon be spending a sum, £240 billion, which is equivalent pretty much to the size of the entire Portuguese economy. Surely this is unsustainably large.
I mean, look, it's an enormous budget and we've put loads of extra money into the NHS, but that's because, breaking news, the Labour Party cares about the NHS and so do the British people, and that's why we're putting our money there. But look, it's not all about money. I mean, one of the reasons people are unhappy with the NHS is because of the way in which services are run. That's not a criticism of our NHS staff who are doing a brilliant job, but when you look at their IT or the buildings or the age of the equipment they get to use to treat us, it's all old and crumbling. There are some parts of the country where things are run better than in other parts of the country. So spending is one part of it, and obviously we're putting a lot of money into the NHS.
I mean, it's sort of roughly half of all day-to-day spending. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's big. I mean, there's no denying that. It's a huge workforce, of course, with all of the doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals that look after us across the country. But look, you're right to point to the fact that there is a huge job of modernisation that also needs to happen, which the Health Secretary and the NHS is now able to get on and do, given that we've settled the budgets with them today.
So you're totally confident your targets, reducing waiting lists, for example, you will definitely hit them?
Yeah, I mean, the targets are the targets. We're working to deliver them. Again, none of these are easy. There are lots of challenges associated with them, but we wouldn't have signed up to them if we didn't think they were important.
Now, interest rates did rise a bit at the beginning of the day and then they fell back, so you haven't had a sort of massive interest rate hit, but there is a risk, particularly given you can't control events in the rest of the world, that you will miss your fiscal rule targets come the autumn. Can you promise that you won't cut any of these budgets if that happens?
Well, look, the numbers in the spending review today spend the budget that was allocated to us by the Chancellor at the autumn budget last year. So there's nothing in the spending review today that requires us to raise money beyond what measures were already taken in last year's budget. You're kind of pointing us ahead to the next fiscal event, which will be the next budget in the autumn of this year, where there'll be a forecast of the economy from the OBR in the normal way. I obviously can't guess what that forecast is going to say. We have to wait to see it later in the year. And then any consideration that has to be taken will be taken by the Chancellor in the normal way.
I mean, I was asking whether there might be cuts in public services, but what you said was there is nothing that you announced today that would, in and of itself, require you to put up taxes in the autumn. That's not quite the same thing as saying that taxes won't go up in the autumn, is it?
Well, there are lots of hypothetical futures we could chat about, but what I can tell you about today is the spending review that we published, and that's on the basis I've just set out with the money we raised at the budget last year. As I say, I don't know what the OBR is going to forecast about the economy in the autumn, and we'll have to talk about that when they publish their forecast.
Can I ask one final question? I've got to be frank, and, this is no disrespect to the Chancellor, but I found it a very confusing statement. What I sort of expected was that she would just go through each department and tell us what was happening. And it was a little bit disappointing that we then had to plough through all the books afterwards to find out. Why did she do it that way?
Oh, well, look, I'm sorry. I'll give her your feedback. Look, I think if the speech was going through reading out numbers for each fiscal year for the next 3 or 4 years...
But it's what people wanted to know. They wanted to know... No, it wouldn't have been boring. People wanted to know... No, I think out there they wanted to know what was happening to their public services. And listening to that speech, you honestly couldn't tell.
Well, look, it was a good political speech from a Labour Chancellor setting out her vision and the vision of the Prime Minister and this government in renewing Britain and making people better off. I mean, it was a political...
But people will notice that there were cuts,
speech.
and she made no reference to any of the cuts. She was running away from the truth.
No, she wasn't. And look, the tables have all been published today. And where departments have got falling cost, whether it's on asylum like we've talked about, or declining rail subsidy because there are more passengers using the trains, these things are good things because we don't want to be spending money on these types of failed public services. The whole point of modernising and getting a grip of public services is not just to deliver better outcomes, but that it's more a cost-effective way of doing it in the future. But look, you've got your books, Robert. You've got all the tables you could wish for in it, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of bedtime reading for you.
As you have implied, I am obviously in statistical heaven. Very good to speak to you, as always. So, John, I was quite struck that he definitely is not ruling out tax rises in the autumn. As you know, the margin of safety they've got under their own fiscal rules is tiny. Yeah. Do you think taxes are going up?
I want taxes to go up on the wealthy. I want a wealth tax to avoid the welfare benefit cuts. I don't want a Labour now to make the mistake of winter fuel allowance by forcing what the government says 250,000
So she seemed to be slightly softening her tone, I thought, about welfare cuts today. Do you think they will change their approach to welfare?
I think the anxiety that there is on Labour backbenchers about further round of welfare benefit cuts means the government's got to think again. I'd rather they were just straight now and said, "Yes, we're going to have to," and then we can then have a proper discussion about where that money's going to come from, whether it's a wealth tax or whether it's further increase, levelling up of capital gains tax with income tax, those sorts of things. It's a bit like, before the election when none of the political parties wanted to have a discussion about the reality of the economy. I think that's where we've got to be over the next couple of months, to be frank.
OK, Richard, I'm going to pick up on all of this in just a couple of minutes. Don't go away, because as you can tell, there's a sort of lively set of issues to discuss with John and Richard, and also with the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride. See you in a moment or two.
Hello, welcome to The Break, #Peston. This is a fun one.
Yeah.
It's Corbyn or Farage. I'm going to read you a number of quotes.
Yeah.
You guess who said it. Okay, here we go. The fact is that the banking system and politics became hand in glove, one and the same thing, and that has been a complete disaster.
Who said it?
Corbyn said that.
Who do you think?
I wouldn't be surprised if it's a recent Farage.
It's a recent Farage.
Really?
Actually, I don't know how recent. I've got. There you go. Jeremy and Nigel. OK, in 1992, when I watched the North Nottingham Miners March down Park Lane, I stood on the side of the road and watched them, and I thought, I'm on their side.
Definitely Nigel.
Were you on their side? In 1992?
I wasn't in politics, but I would have been.
I was on the march.
You were on
On
it?
the march.
I used to work for the NUM.
And he was standing by your side and he was cheering you on, John.
He's alive.
It was Nigel Farage. It was 92. If the establishment thought we represented politics as usual, that we could be bought off, that nothing was really going to change, they wouldn't attack us so ferociously. Why bother?
That feels like Nigel.
Feels like Nigel?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to tell you, it was Jeremy.
It was Jeremy.
Oh.
Could have been
I mean,
either.
the truth is, there's not a cigarette paper between
could have
them,
been
is
either,
there?
couldn't it, really? Yeah.
In almost every country in which the West has intervened or even implied support for regime change, the situation has been made worse, not better. The most devastating direct consequences of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have not been suffered by the likes of Mr. Blair, but by the civilian populations of these countries. Yeah, do you think?
Just Jeremy.
Nigel Farage.
You're joking.
Oh, this is a great goal.
Are you watching this, John, thinking,
this is fun.
actually, me and Nigel?
Oh, he's an absolute chameleon, isn't he?
Kinship.
Nigel and
I'm
Jezza.
loving this. I'm absolutely loving this.
I mean, there is an agreement on these issues. OK, we have a European bureaucracy
They
totally
both said it.
unaccountable
They
to
both
anybody.
Both said that.
Powers have gone from national parliaments. Well, only one of them said it with these exact words.
Yeah. I think that's early Jeremy.
Early Jeremy.
I think that's
before he changed
consistent
his mind,
that's
or before he
consistent
was
Nigel.
told to say something else.
Early Jeremy.
It is Jeremy, I think.
Yeah.
It's Jeremy? Yeah, OK. We've got one more. And water companies. Let them go bust. Why should we protect bondholders?
That's definitely Nigel.
agree?
There would have been nationalisation in there if it had been Jeremy.
It was Nigel.
Oh,
Are you surprised?
finally.
Guys, are you surprised? I mean, that is extraordinary.
No.
On any one of them, you could have chosen
That's what
either.
right-wing populists always do, don't they?
Well, or is there actually
Well, you
some
meant to say
agreement?
is maybe we're right.
And Mel, maybe you didn't agree with any of them.
Yeah.
Well, no, I think it's just left-wing populists and right-wing populists, you see. They sort of merge into the same thing.
Well, it's a big topic, but we haven't got
Yeah,
time.
but we do it, they don't.
Welcome back. In a moment or two, I will be talking to the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, but I think you're going to share with us some facts about reform that might lead to a conversation with Mr. Tice.
The Chancellor did seem to make a point of repeatedly referring to Reform UK in her statement today. So I wanted to talk about your fiscal policies, if that is OK. The Group Policy Engine have modelled some of the key commitments since the last election, and you can see that they are quite costly. In 28-29, it costs almost £50 billion to raise the personal allowance to £20,000, almost £30 billion to set the higher rate threshold to 70 grand, less than £2.2 billion to repeal the two-child limit, and even lower to raise the marriage allowance rate to 25%. But in total, that adds up to almost £80 billion. Now, that is less than Reform set out in their own election manifesto, but it is still big, and as we have heard, it is bigger than Liz Truss's giveaways in her mini-budget. Now, who would gain from all of this? Policy Engine looked at the impact across the income scale, from the poorest households over here to the richest households over here. You can see that the very poorest gain the least. The big wins are further up the income scale, although it does drop back again for the very richest. Now, do the public buy it? This poll from More in Common shows that 46%, the biggest group, think reform would be a risk to the economy versus 29% who disagreed. That said, the gap almost disappears if you slightly change the statement and you compare them to other parties. Then 41% still think reform is too big a risk to the economy, but 40% think they can't be worse than the rest of them when it comes to managing the economy.
So I want to pick up with Richard, since this is your bailiwick. You have many supporters who are not well off. Why are your proposed tax changes disproportionately helping the better off?
Well, we think that actually lifting the income tax threshold from £12,500 to £20,000, that helps the lowest paid, the least well off, the most.
But it doesn't. We've just seen the distributional analysis. It wasn't made up, that analysis.
What it does, Robert, is that it motivates people back into work, and that is a very good thing. There's another key point, Robert. Actually, it's a much less inflationary way of putting more money into people's pockets than giving pay rises of 2 or 3% with all of the extra costs, which is another benefit that isn't taken into account in those calculations.
And just to be, but to be clear, you focused on the 20,000 income tax threshold.
That's our key point.
But you're also saying that the higher rate of tax should be lifted to £70,000.
We did it,
and that just by definition helps better
that was
off
what we
people.
talked about at the last election. But the key thrust of it...
So you're not committed to that anymore?
Well, no one's committed to a historic manifesto, are they? Right? I mean...
It sounds like a no, you're not committed anymore.
But the point is, at the time, that's what we thought's right. At the time, we said, we did the calculations, and, for example, the voluntary decision by the Bank of England to pay interest on the printed money then was over 30 billion. Now it's about, because interest rates...
Way less, it's way less.
No, it's
but
not,
you're still not going to cover the 70 billion hole.
No, I'm sorry, Robert, that's simply not the case, right? It's now about 20, based on the current printed money, based on 4.25%, it's 26 billion a year. That's assuming...
Hang on, the black hole is 70 billion, Richard. So even if it is 26.5, and I think it's nearer 15, because obviously, you know, I looked at this in my own work, actually before you did,
well,
but nonetheless, it's a significant sum of money, but it doesn't cover your black hole.
No, but then we've talked about saving £5 in 100. Now we're running councils. We're already starting to see huge sums that we're beginning to save literally in a matter of weeks, we've identified tens and tens and tens of millions of pounds of
Millions, not
savings.
billions, not billions. Where's the billions going to come from?
I'm literally talking about in a couple of councils where we literally just lifted the bonnet. And then if you scrap net stupid zero, you save billions as well. So all of these numbers actually, the waste in the government sector is absolutely
honestly,
vast.
Richard, with the best word in the world, I'm
No,
trying to be
Robert,
very fair to you. You're not getting anywhere near 70
You're being
billion quid.
ludicrous, right? The OBR
I'm
says...
definitely not
the OBR
being ludicrous.
says that over a 10-year period, the voluntary decision to pay interest on those reserves is over £200 billion.
We're talking about a single year's 70 billion. Even if it were that kind of number over 10 years, we're still only talking about 20 billion a year, right?
Robert, on over £1 trillion worth of annual spending, £5 and 100 is £50 billion. We're already seeing you can save huge sums. Are you saying that you can't save any money?
No,
anywhere?
I'm not saying that,
Well,
but
then...
I'm saying that at the moment, your plans are riskier than Liz Truss's, and she came very close to not being able to borrow.
She didn't talk about saving anything at all. What I've done is trigger a proper debate, a responsible debate, that we've got economists agreeing with me on this QE issue. We've got 2 former governors of the Bank of England agreeing with me. You can negotiate the amount, Robert.
The good news is you have got a few years to get your sums to add up. So, I know, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to come back to you later.
You clearly don't understand maths,
I've got
Robert.
to now talk to... You can have your chance in a minute, OK? So no, you're not going away, I hope. Anyway, I'm delighted to have Mel Stride here, who's the Shadow Chancellor. Now, I want to take us back to what we heard today. And putting to one side, which we can come back to in a minute or two, your general concerns about the overall management of the economy. I just want to know, in terms of what they committed to today, let's say in investment spending and, for example, the bigger numbers in health service spending, what have they done that you wouldn't do?
So I don't think you can get away from the broader...
No, I know you want to come back here, but just answer my question. First of all, just answer my question.
I'm going to very directly.
OK.
Which is that at the end of the day, you have to ask the questions about where the money is coming from and can we afford it. Now, where the money is coming from is a lot of tax, a lot of which is being borne by businesses, which has been bad for growth.
No, we know all
and
this.
A lot
and we've heard this before on this programme.
No, but Robert, you can't get away from this. If you're saying, what would you do, or what should they have done differently, or whatever, the fundamental thing is you've got to be able to afford to do this kind of stuff. And what they're doing is taking on
So if it's not affordable, then you're basically saying you wouldn't
debt.
be spending this money on health. We
would have started from a very different place. So we would not have come in to power and ramped up taxes on businesses through national insurance. We wouldn't have talked down the economy and damaged growth. We would not have gone on a tax and spending splurge.
Sorry, now I've got to point out, you had close to zero living standards growth for the 14 years you were in power. Right. Nothing fundamentally changed for the worse when they came in, because they inherited, frankly, a stagnant economy, and that was your fault.
Actually, what they inherited was the fastest growing economy in the G7, near record level of employment.
Which lasted for about 3 months towards the end of your time in office.
Low level of unemployment. Inflation that had been brought down to bang on target at 2% on the day of the general election. Where are we on in inflation now? We're up at about 3.5%. It's almost double where we were when we left office. And my point is, by doing all these things, like taxing businesses, by introducing inflationary pressures, by bumping up inflation, by keeping interest rates higher for longer, and adding to the national debt, if you look at the servicing costs on that debt, it's about 100 billion a year. That's twice what we spend on defence.
What you haven't said is what she did today. You haven't identified a single thing she's done today that you think is the wrong choice. Look, you have a different approach to the general stewardship of the economy, and we can come back to that. But I asked you a very specific question.
It's all connected because...
But it's only connected in the sense that you don't want to answer the question.
Can it be afforded? And in the context, you've made this point earlier, of the wafer-thin a headroom that she has against her fiscal targets, which she blew from the budget back in autumn of last year. She repaired in the spring, but it appears she's probably blown it all over again. And the headwinds that we're likely to get around tariffs and trade, around possibly what might happen in the bond market.
Just to be absolutely clear, that's Trump's fault. That is not her fault.
No, but you've got to have an economy that can withstand that, OK? If you're going to go out and splurge a lot of money on a lot of different things and talk about investment left, right and centre...
People around the country recognise we have transport that's not up to the mark. We haven't got enough house building. We haven't got enough nuclear power. Yeah. And you're not endorsing any of that.
Look,
People will think that's really odd.
Of course, investment in the economy is a good thing, but the point that I'm making is it has to be on the basis that it's affordable and responsible. And the problem is that when you're in a position where you've got an anemically growing economy because of the poor choices that you've
But
got.
you had 14 years to sort it, and most people would say in those 14 years you were largely incompetent, and that is the problem.
No, we went through things like COVID that shrank the economy by over 10% overnight. We went through the UK-Russian war, at the start of that, and the spike in energy costs and very strong inflationary pressures. We had big challenges to face.
What you're doing is blaming external circumstances.
No, let's be really clear. Where we are heading to in the autumn under this government is almost certainly tax increases, which will once again get us into that kind of doom loop of additional taxes, slower growth, and all of that because of the choices.
You and John can have a row about this after the programme because he thinks tax rises are a good thing. We'll come back to all of this in a minute. Don't go away because, as you've gathered, there's a lot more to talk to Mel, John and Richard about. See you in a minute.
Hello, we're talking about bus stops.
Go on.
It didn't last long, did it? Was it last week? Elon Musk described Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill as a disgusting abomination. He then tweeted that he thought Donald Trump was going to be in the Jeffrey Epstein files. He then deleted the tweet and said maybe he went too far, but they're not really getting on. What do you make of this clash?
I don't think anybody's surprised, are they? I mean, actually, my own boss probably semi-fell out with Elon at first.
Yeah, were you surprised when Elon suddenly turned on Nigel?
I was surprised.
Doesn't he want Rupert Lowe to be leader?
Well, I have no idea. You should ask him. But he does ebb and flow quite a bit. But he does make great products that I enjoy.
Who's going to win in the end?
Oh, the president.
John?
They'll damage each other badly, I should think. And
You
even
think?
if they get back together, they'll fall out in about 3 months' time. Won't they?
How important is it having the support of someone like Elon Musk? You were excited, weren't you, when you thought maybe he was coming in with a lot of money?
I never thought anything would happen, but...
You were a bit excited.
I think that... I mean, he is interested in the UK because he's got a lot of money invested here. He's got big businesses here. But at the end of the day, he's an extraordinary entrepreneur. And with that, sometimes comes slightly unpredictable characteristics.
Any other people you want to mention there? What about, let's think of some other good bus stops. What about Boris Johnson v Dominic Cummings?
You were in the chamber, I mean...
Well, I thought, again, I wasn't sure who was dominant at different times, but Cummings almost operated, though he was the Prime Minister. Sort of delusions of grandeur at different times.
Do you miss him? Could the Conservative Party do with a bit
You
of
were
Dominic
well
Cummings?
rid of
on?
him.
I'd probably
you?
give that one to Boris on the basis of the vaccine rollout and his total support for Ukraine. So
Do you think Boris Johnson would have survived if it wasn't for Dominic Cummings?
Oh, I can't.
Here's a good one.
No.
Tony Blair v Gordon Brown.
Yeah.
Is that a good one? Do you think they ever got on?
They always, the thing that happened was that Brown thought the deal had been done, with the restaurant and all that.
Granita.
Sort of thing. Yeah, Granita. And then when it wasn't delivered, it got pretty bitter, I think, at that time. And I think...
Seen a bit of that, Robert?
I've written quite a lot about this over the years. How long have you got?
Just read Robert's books. Am I allowed to even say that? I'm not. I might
You're
not
allowed
be.
to say it. Still available somewhere.
Have I got time for one more? Margaret Thatcher v Geoffrey Howe?
Oh, that
20
was
seconds
brilliant.
on that.
That was the best. The broken bat speech was brilliant, wasn't it?
But Thatcher won that, overall.
Thatcher won it.
just-
Except
Except
quite quickly won it. Prime Minister
nonetheless,
as well.
how I think was
At the end, but...
It was the start of the end.
It
wasn't
was the start.
It really was.
It was
yeah.
extraordinary.
And that's the time
That
out.
was proper. Welcome back. I'm delighted that Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, is still with me. So let's just talk a bit about your plan. So one of the things you do talk about quite a lot, and Kemi Badenoch talks about quite a lot, is the need to cut regulations. I'm always slightly puzzled by this because pretty much every regulation that's in force was introduced by your government.
So we've got to, under new leadership, take our time to look at every single area of government. And
So all the regulations you created, you're going to abolish?
Ask a simple question, which is, do they lean into growth or do they lean away from growth? And you can look at some of the have regards, some of the remits of some of these arm's length bodies and regulators, and the answer is they don't sufficiently lean into growth. They're often loaded up with lots of other objectives and things. So
But
I
why
think
do
we
you
need
think
to have a
your
root and a
Tory
branch.
predecessors thought they were a good thing then?
Well, I think everybody, whatever time they've been in politics, has always been able to point to things that need reform. And what we're saying is we now have the time between now and the next general election to do the deep thinking around that and many other issues to make sure that we have a very robust plan to get regulation out of the way of business. Now, what the Labour Party is doing, obviously, is with their employment rights bill and all the rest of it, is going to be loading up businesses still further with red tape and things that will slow them down and will not actually generate a more rapidly growing economy.
Although,
So
as it happens, they've also written to all the economic regulators and told them to stop
they've had
doing
them all in.
stuff that is precisely what you've said they should do, that they should
Yeah.
stop doing stuff that leans against growth.
Yeah, well,
So that's a good thing. So that's a good thing then.
Well, let's see where that leads. If it leads to anything, that's absolutely fine. But yes, I mean, you take the FCA, for example, it has a series of different remits. Many of them are not about growth. I think you do have to look at the balance between allowing risk to occur within a marketplace if allowing a bit more risk allows more growth and doesn't tie people up in knots and red tape. And I think the FCA would be one of those areas that we might look at. They have 50,000 different financial advisors that they regulate beneath them, and they're an important part of the economy. So, of course, we've got to deep dive into those areas to find the right solutions.
Now, you made it absolutely clear in your recent policy shifting speech that the approach taken by the temporary Prime Minister Liz Truss, in your view, was totally wrong. Debt-funded tax cuts. She says that you, these are her words, kowtow to failed Treasury orthodoxy. It is certainly true that the Treasury has presided over an era of stagnation. Do you buy into Treasury orthodoxy?
What I buy into is the fact that we have, as an economy, for far too long, decades in fact, underperformed on productivity and growth.
And is that the Treasury's fault?
Well, I think there are many. The Treasury needs to be looked at, as does the OBR, as does the Bank of England. All these institutions are important. But things like the tax system and the level of the tax burden is very important. The size of the state is very important. Skills, universities, what they're doing is important. The welfare, getting on top of welfare costs is really important. Supply side things, building houses, roads, rail, reservoirs and so on. Getting energy costs in our country down is very important. And those kind of things, some of those challenges are certainly not amenable to pulling a quick magic lever that makes them all right in 5 minutes. And that's why Kemi Badenoch is absolutely right that we must take our time, as Margaret Thatcher did when she became leader in 75 in the run-up to the 79 election, to grapple with those really deep-rooted challenges and come up with the right answer.
But Margaret Thatcher had, I would argue, slightly more time than you have because she didn't have Richard Tice and Nigel Farage basically eating your lunch. She could take her time. There are only two dominant parties in those days. So, I mean, by the time she's come up with these compelling policies, you won't exist.
So we have come out with a number of policies, actually, Robert, and interestingly, what you're basically saying is they haven't cut through. Things like reversing the APR tax changes, which is going to hit family farms, reversing the BPR tax changes, which this government brought in, which will damage family businesses.
Hang on, these are not economically you know this. These are relative in terms of the prospects of the UK. Whether they're good or bad, these are not policies that are going to transform the economic prospects of the UK. They're just criticisms of the current government. I'm now going to try, though, and try and get a bit of bonding, actually, between all three of you. Because I suspect the one thing that you would all agree on is that Treasury orthodoxy is not a great thing.
That's true, but look, I think
you see?
I think you've fundamentally misunderstood the political situation. We've got reform into a policy of magical realism. And I think the Tories have been taken over by a Trotskyite sect of permanent revolution. So I think if you understand it in those terms, you might.
And where have you gone?
Well, I'm a
You're now a centrist. John is now a centrist. Your Prime Minister's copying reform policies. Actually, I think you're right. Treasury orthodoxy is a major problem, as well as civil service orthodoxy. And we have to be much bolder and much more radical, because otherwise nobody's going to be able to. Nobody's going to be changed. Because the reality is growth is at the lowest level for 70 years.
There is an argument I looked at, which was about reforming the Treasury and making it just a finance department and then having a separate economic department, the way Harold Wilson did at that point.
Yeah.
That didn't work because the Treasury was so resistant to it. And I looked at it, and I got Bob Kersley to do me a paper on that. And he says, actually, in your first term, it's too much to go on, but you could in your second term. But I actually think it's important. I think the Treasury...
Having a separate growth department, I think almost everybody sensible would know.
Yeah, I think so.
Must be.
I think we've moved on, haven't we, basically?
That I think is weirdly something that I think quite a lot of people could agree on now. But Anushka, I think you're going to possibly move the conversation on. I don't know.
Well, I'll just show you a bit of reaction to the spending review this evening. So this is Alex Wickham, who says defence spending will be flat until 2029 after it hits 2.6% of GDP in 2027, noticing that there's no further incremental annual rise once 2.6% is reached, while we all know that there is pressure from NATO now to go up to 3.5%. And let me just show you a couple of front pages. That's The Independent. I think Rachel Reeves will be pretty happy with that. Spend now, tax later, question mark. No, I choose national renewal.
Pleased with tax later, Anushka?
Well, I think she's going to be pleased with what they then go on to say, which is her message. She wants this to be about national renewal. And she's had, tonight, she's seen Labour MPs, and they're all very, very happy with her. And she was in quite a difficult position. So I think she's feeling pretty boosted. Maybe not after she watches some of the commentary. And here again from the FT, Reeves launches £113 billion renewal push. But obviously, the tax point may come back to haunt her.
Yeah, renewal in inverted commas is not necessarily something she wants to see.
So what happens by then at the budget if there's no growth at all? So how bad will the numbers go then? Very bad indeed, and they will be into serious tax rises or dramatic levels of borrowing. That's potentially where we're headed, Robert.
I have a sort of budget rubric, which is the louder applause on the day, the greater the disappointment by the weekend. And what you'll see now, all of us going through the detail of all of that, and you'll find all those individual elements. And eventually, then the Chancellor has to come back and address those individual points. And that's.
One of the things that's jolly interesting to me is that Yvette Cooper, who's one of the few people in this cabinet who's been in the cabinet before, was the one minister who didn't settle, and she didn't settle because she didn't believe she had enough for the police. And I think there is certainly a risk that actually crime doesn't fall and the police can't do the job and they will have to come back for more.
Well, even on health, we also used to be told you'd need at least 3% a year just to stand still because of the ageing population. It's 2.8% today. And also, if you look at what last year, when the workforce strategy was brought forward, the requirement was 3.6%. I think we're going to have to open up this discussion definitely about departmental spending day to day, because that's what people will feel in advance of any infrastructure.
Now, we'll ask each of you a very quick question. It's all the same question. Are taxes going up in the autumn?
Almost certainly.
John? If I can help it, yes.
What's your answer?
Almost certainly, yeah.
Right, that's it. Prepare yourself. To be clear, there are some external factors that may go for or against her. And there are certain things out of her control, namely one, Donald Trump. Now, that is it shortly. I'm off to Canada, where the leaders of the G7 rich nations, including our own Prime Minister Keir Starmer, will meet and attempt to agree solutions to the world's big problems with Donald Trump. What could possibly go wrong? I'll report back next Wednesday. Bye-bye.